All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here, we're looking at Penn State quarterback Drew Allar. Will he be a boom or bust prospect in 2024? Obviously, coming off of a inconsistent but at times impressive debut season as a starter. Coming out of high school, this guy was a five-star recruit, up to 6'5", 243 with some really great size. He can uncork the deep ball with ease. Has that big-time arm. Can really make impressive throws on the run. You had that Josh Allen comparison coming out of high school, Nick. A lot to like from a raw prospect talent. A lot of people are expecting Allar to come in and just uplift this offense. It could kind of, Trace McSorley, it was really good under Sean Clifford. It seemed like his ceiling had been maxed, very early on in his tenure, but he ended up being, a somewhat successful and productive quarterback. But Allar was supposed to be the guy that was going to uplift this offense to new levels that would, project them to a Big Ten title and potentially the playoffs. 2,631 yards, 25 touchdowns, only 2 interceptions. One of them came against Indiana and then in the bowl game. So he really protected the ball well. The Nittany Lions had to do a lot of short work considering the deficiencies of, the interior offensive line, the lack of vertical speed that we already knew about. We knew these things were going to be an issue, right? And I think that was one thing that Mike Yursich, the play caller, certainly took into account. There's a lot of things working against Allar, Nick, and I think for him to be able to only throw 2 interceptions is pretty impressive considering you had to go above and beyond for this offense to really thrive through the air. And we're going to talk about some games and how he performed in a little later on in this episode. Would you consider this past season for Drew Allar a success?
It's a very interesting prospect when you look at him coming out of high school originally. Early on in his cycle, he was a 3-star and then got a late boost after his senior, or toward the tail end of his senior year, ended up as a 5-star with 247. Got a lot of love coming out of Ohio. He was Mr. Football Ohio in 2021. Ends up at Penn State. Seemed like a good fit for him. He looked at some other schools. I know Ohio State was sniffing around, of course, on their own territory there. They wanted to make a move on that. He ends up at Penn State, and it seemed like a really nice match for this team. This is a team, like you said, with Sean Clifford that kind of had met their ceiling. Clifford really tapped out. And you bring in a guy here that looked like he could be really dynamic, was able to move on the ground as well and throw out of the pocket. It just hasn't really worked so far. The completion percentage is what really concerns me, just below 60%. He is good at protecting the ball, right? The 2 turnovers is an impressive stat when you look at it, 25 passing touchdowns, but that doesn't really tell the full story in my opinion. I think it was a disappointment. A lot of people were talking about him as potential Heisman, sneaky Heisman, dark horse early in the season. A lot of people were loving him in August, and he came out and had a pretty good game against West Virginia in week 1, 21 of 29 for 325 and 3 scores, which really kind of started to set his bar up. But then when you play the tougher teams, it got worse throughout the season. Struggled against Ohio State, struggled against Michigan. We'll get to that at some point. Didn't look great against Ole Miss. Looked bad against some weaker teams in Rutgers and UMass as well at times. So certainly a questionable body of work. I think he's a player that has a ton of potential. We just didn't really see exactly what we were hoping to see in year 1.
Yeah, 2 interceptions, that's great, but at the same time, when you're less aggressive downfield because of being, lack of confidence, having that nervousness, and also not having guys really open down the field other than some tight ends, that can certainly lead to that as well. Like you said, doesn't fully tell the story. And, going to that Ohio State game, a lot of Penn State fans were not happy with me saying that these guys, I'm not even sure if they'll score 10 points. And what do you know? They garbage time their way into barely eclipsing that number. And the reason I said that is, the first 2 games on the road in 2023, they were pretty poor at Illinois, at Northwestern. Allar did not play very well. He had a total of a 54.5% completion rating on the road this season. In the 2 games prior to that, he had that number or less. And then against Ohio State, 18 of 42, 43% completion rating, 191 yards. Some more numbers for him on the road. He had more yards per game, but he also had 8.5 more attempts per contest. So those are kind of skewed there. And look at that game in Columbus. We'll get to the Maryland game after that, but versus Ohio State, I figured they would struggle because he had been poor in those road starts going to Columbus. You're not going to bode well. And, I will preface by saying Ohio State did have a lot of great coverage, some nice stunts that the offensive line really got burned by. The play calling was also subpar. But even some of the other stuff they tried to get involved, like a quick swing pass to the running back on 3rd and short, dropped. Some of the screens not blocked well are also drops. There's a lot of things that this offense has to work on, right? What I did see, some tight window throws connected on a few slants. He was able to execute on those. Made plenty of bad decisions on routes that were clearly covered in terms of throws, trying to force it into windows. He had a play right before half that, he steps up into the pocket, clear running lane for at least 7 yards. Instead, he throws it out of bounds to a covered wide receiver on a go route. with what was also a pretty awkward throwing motion. And Nick, this is one you brought up to me a second ago, and I was like, I saw the exact same play, and that right there just kind of sums up at least that first half. Where I'll talk about the rest of the game here in a minute, but that play right there in big games, I know it's not much, running for 7 yards, potentially a first down, but that offense had a chance to get in gear. And, when they struggled that significantly on the road in Columbus, plays like that, you got to have them. And that just kind of sums up a lot of the inconsistencies we saw with Allar over this past season.
That play late in the first half was a play that extremely bothered me when I watched the film back, because it's like you said, he could have made a move and run. I think there was someone shadowing a linebacker that may have dropped in, or a safety, but I still think he could have gotten at least 8-9 yards, potentially even the first down, move the chains in a close situation. At this point, that's a 10-6 game with Penn State with the ball right before half. You can go down and get a field goal, make this a 1-point game, or potentially even score and take the lead at halftime. But just poor decision making like that is going to cost you. Throwing into double coverage to a guy that's just not even open on the sideline is really a poor decision to make. I will give him credit. He got better as season went on the road. The Maryland and Michigan State games, well, Michigan State, was more of a neutral site, but still got better in those two games. Looked really good against Maryland. 25 of 34, 240 yards, 73% comp rate. 17 of 26, 292, and 65% comp rate against Michigan State, but struggled against Ohio State, struggled on the road at Northwestern, struggled on the road against Illinois, struggled in some home games as well, at home to Rutgers, at home to Michigan. So I think the decision making has to be a little bit better. They got their tight ends involved a lot. They threw a lot of slant routes, a lot of over the middle to tight ends, and which worked for them, but he needs to be able to uncork a deep ball at times as well. They really seemed uncomfortable. It seemed like when they were trying to hit them downfield, they would make mistakes and throw into tough areas. There weren't a lot of turnovers, but there were a lot of turnover potential balls that he threw. That is a very concerning thing if you're a Penn State fan.
Yeah, I mean, kind of, the last point on that Buckeye game is, he had a number of batted balls, didn't show much creativity on the angles, overall just very poor ball placement in that game, being late, or maybe even potentially too early sometimes, where he was just feeling pressure that sometimes wasn't there, even though, again, the offensive line was getting absolutely beat up. So, again, it's not all on him, Nick, but they couldn't even execute the simple things, whether it was his fault or somebody else's. And we will say that these games we're talking about, the 3 road games, were over the first half of the season. Obviously, it's a big learning curve to go through. And then after that, it seemed like he kind of turned a bit of a corner, against Indiana. This was also a game that was also kind of poor. They looked to move the pocket a little bit more. There was a 3rd and 13 early on, in clean pocket versus a 3-man rush, makes one read, then instantly dumps it to the running back who was flat out covered. 2 plays earlier, he took a shot in a 1v1 go route that was covered while the running back was wide open on a swing route. I mean, it's just a frustrating sequence, is it not, Nick, especially early on in the game?
I think it is a very frustrating sequence. These are opportunities where they can make a bigger play happen, and they fail to do so by poor reads of the defense. That was something that I noticed in the film, is that he either releases the ball too soon, the play is not developed, or releases the ball too late, stands in the pocket too long. His timing seems to be off across the board. Yes, the offensive line was not fantastic for Penn State this year. They had issues in pass protection, but it felt like he was either too early or too late and can't seem to find that middle ground where he needed to be. Being too early, the play doesn't develop properly. Your wide receiver is not ready for the ball, potentially get intercepted. If you're too late, you can take a big hit or potentially throw the ball into a bad window. So if you have that timing issue, that's tough to kind of learn. You could hopefully get that with experience and playing time to slowly get more comfortable with that, but it's tough if you don't have that timing down early on, because you're going to be just making mistakes over and over again.
Yeah, on that next drive, it was 3rd and long, threw a nice ball being pressured. It was dropped right off of the hands of the pass catcher, and he was pressured due to a missed assignment from the running back. So, I mean, it's just so many negatives really working against him and this offense. Showed the ability to find his man on some of those shorter routes, though, when the timing was there. Sometimes it was kind of awkward, though. Some of the completions, the receivers would have to lunge a little bit. It seemed very awkward, Nick, and I know I'm aware that you know what I'm talking about. He threw a nice arcing touchdown to his tight end as well in the end zone. I like his ability to arc the ball. That's something he can do. He does it a little too often off of his back foot, I would say, and that sometimes gets him in trouble. Late in that game, he threw a bad interception where the blitz was picked up, and the pocket was pretty sound, but he didn't work the field properly, and he panicked when the rushers finally arrived, and he just launched it off his back foot. Traffic deep into his own territory. They had the ball in Indiana thrown 35 minutes to go. The ability to take the lead, Nick, that's a horrible play. Throws 2 straight completions, though, when the game was tied. 2 minutes left, including a 57-yard strike down the sideline for the win. Game-winning touchdown there. That shows you the potential, right? And I love the ability for him to be able to bounce back after just the worst play he probably had all season long. Could have costed his team the entire season there. And then he ends up delivering there late in the game with his arm. So there is not just bad with Allar. But again, another interesting sequence you'd rather avoid.
Right, a sequence you certainly want to avoid, throwing off your back foot, a mistake you cannot make. That and throwing across your body are the two biggest mistakes you cannot make. It is promising that he bounces back. Like you said, it's great that he bounced back and was able to get that drive together and win the game against Indiana. But he could be in a situation where he can avoid putting his team in that situation. It's great if you're the hero, but if you're the reason they're in that tough situation, you have to be the hero. It kind of undershadows it for me a little bit there. Just a bad decision to throw that ball and a bad interception, which he didn't have a lot of them, right? He only had two, had one in the bowl game, only one in the regular season. But if you're only going to have one interception and it's going to be in a clutch time, that means a lot more than having 5 interceptions in games that don't matter where you're winning by a whole lot. So it's certainly all about perspective when you look at the turnovers with him.
And versus Maryland, they played Ohio State, Indiana, and then Maryland over that 3-week stretch. Versus the Terrapins, this is the best game of his career, 240 yards, 4 scores, threw some really good balls. He had a nice fade in the right corner for his first score of the game. Had another tight window throw to his tight end, barely beating the second defender in the end zone. It was a beautiful ball that he threw. And his last touchdown was also, another incredibly arced ball. Worked the red zone really well in that game. Trusted his arm talent and his wide receivers. Led to an offensive explosion versus a solid defense, Nick. And they had been struggling for 2 weeks again. Against Indiana, we just kind of broke that one down. Ohio State was abysmal. Then here against Maryland, a team that again was a pretty sound defense, put up the best numbers he had all season long. A very rare offensive explosion from the Nittany Lions. Games like that where he's trusting his guys, trusting his arm. The play caller's also opening up a little bit more. Beautiful things can happen for this offense, but it was very far and few.
I think if you can open up the playbook a little bit and have some success, it could work out. In the game against Maryland, he also had 4 carries for 39 yards, including a 21-yard carry. That was a very nice thing to see with his feet. You didn't see him use his feet a whole lot this year, right? 74 carries for 210 yards. You want to see more, 4 scores on the ground. But you saw a little bit of that flash against Maryland. You saw him look good in the pocket, 73.5% comp rate, 4 touchdowns through the air, 240. Solid numbers across the board, picking apart that Maryland defense. The playbook looked good that day, and it was really promising. That's a great start on the road and a great win for this team. But then when you go look at what happened right after that at Michigan and Rutgers, it kind of seems like that game against Maryland was an outlier on the whole body of work because he had a bad couple weeks right after that.
The Michigan game was abysmal, 3 yards per attempt, 10 of 23. The same deficiencies, I think, really started to haunt them there, but at times you got to rise up and be able to deliver. And he wasn't able to make some of the simple plays, and neither was the rest of this offense. I didn't go back and watch the Michigan game. I'm just kind of remembering what I saw in that disappointment. Where I picked Penn State to win that game, I thought Allar would be able to be a little bit more consistent. I thought they'd have a little bit more balance, and it was just awful. They wasted an elite defensive performance that day against Rutgers, 6 of 13, 79 yards. I don't remember if he got hurt or anything in that game, so I'm not going to speculate. I didn't remember, and I didn't go back to look. The final 2 games of the year, though, neutral sites had 290 plus yards in both of those games, 4 touchdowns as well through the air. So it seems like he's getting a little bit more comfortable, Nick. What do you think your confidence is in him going forward on the road? Because that game was against the Terrapins. They were traveling there, best game of the year. So he's showing his ability to get a little bit more comfortable, I think. The games he had over the back half of the year, very sporadic, right? But you saw a little bit more good than bad, even though the box score does indicate he had some very rough efforts.
You did see some good game. You saw a good performance there against that Maryland team. I think when you look at the rest of it, though, I get a little concerned, especially when I look at that game against Ole Miss in the bowl game. Yes, right, did have 295 yards, but a 48% comp rate plus interception against the Rebels in a loss. That is concerning, in my opinion. You look at that doesn't really paint a great picture. He needs to get more comfortable on the road. He got better throughout the season, right? That's positive. Certainly you can say that. But they have a lot of tough road tests coming up this year. They start the year at West Virginia in Morgantown. That's a very tough atmosphere. Those West Virginia fans are going to be very loud and proud at USC, at Wisconsin, at Purdue, at Minnesota this year. So there are some tough games on the schedule. Certainly not anything crazy in the back half, but USC, Wisconsin, those are going to be tough games where it's going to be loud environments where he's going to have to get focused and make sure to complete his passes, complete his full routes. He can't be jittery. He's got to be focused, stay calm in the pocket. Certainly, easier said than done. I have some confidence going into the season. I think the schedule is helpful a little bit. I also think that he's got another season of practice under his belt, some great experience learning the reps. It is a little concerning. I'm going to take, a middle of the road, cautiously optimistic approach with him on the road this year. Yep.
And that leads us to the final topic. They pick up a new offensive coordinator, Andy Kotelnicki. Should certainly be more creative. Utilize Allar's legs slightly more. He's not a dual threat by any means, but he's got some nice mobility. They're going to incorporate, I think, some more RPOs should certainly allow him to showcase his ability to fire into those tight windows. The Kansas quarterback play was pretty solid between Jalen Daniels and Jason Bean. They're able to, switch quarterbacks when Daniels got hurt, and Bean was able to really thrive when he had to come in for relief over the last 2 years. So that's important to know. A school like Kansas that can do that, Penn State should be able to do that as well. And what I mean by that is that Allar should be able to elevate the rest of his team within this scheme. I think that's certainly going to be the expectation here. I think, obviously they pick up Julian Fleming. Harrison Wallace is going to be more healthy. Tyler Warren is back. The interior offensive line, really the whole line with Olu Fashanu departing. That's a pretty questionable part of this offense, but I definitely think that some more creativity is going to benefit Allar and co. I think 3,500 yards, that's going to be good for him. That's going to be the bar for me, at least. I think you'll see some more turnovers there. I'm going to be happy for him if he's throwing interceptions early on in the season if they're being aggressive, because I'm going to clap and I'm going to go, that's what I want to see Penn State do. Attack downfield, be more aggressive, let this quarterback use his arm. I'm not going to be mad at turnovers one bit, Nick, because that's what I want to see early on is aggressiveness.
I do want to see this team be more aggressive here. They have a great coordinator in Nittany, previously at Wisconsin, Whitewater, Buffalo, Kansas, been around with Leopold for a while. He leaves Leopold for the first time, heads to Penn State, a big opportunity for him. I like how this offense can be more dynamic. I want to see him involve his legs more often, right? 210 on the ground this season. I want to see more than that, certainly. 2,600 yards passing. I think he can get to 3,000 this year, certainly, if they explore the playbook a little bit. I'm on board with you. I want to see them be aggressive early on. I think you have to be aggressive in some of these earlier games to kind of get them comfortable before you go on and play your USC, UCLA's, and other tough teams on the schedule. I certainly don't think he's going to be a Heisman front runner or a Heisman dark horse even really at this point, but I think he can have a really good season in the new look Big Ten. I think he'd be comfortable as long as that offensive line can find a way to hold up and provide him some protection. He's got some good weapons returning, has some good opportunities to throw those guys. He could be in line for a pretty good season. I think 3,000 yards is a very achievable goal with a new coordinator for Drew Allar.
I also want to see that completion percentage also uptick because ball placement at times was very poor. Plenty of negatives here, Nick. There's more negatives than there was positives, I think, in Allar's debut season as a starter. But I think things are hopeful for him because this is still a guy who has tremendous amounts of talent, and that's always a strong base to work with. And so I think this is a guy that's certainly going to play better next season. And if he doesn't, then James Franklin and crew, it's just going to be tough. It's really going to be hard for them. A lot of questions that no one's really going to be able to answer in 2024, Nick. We don't see this offense improve. It's going to start with a quarterback position. That's going to be it for today's episode, Nick. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. If they have to improve early on, James Franklin Company need to see success out of their offense. He has a lot of opportunities here, another year to learn the playbook, a big figure, a really good quarterback, a ton of untapped potential. We just didn't see that entirely this past season. Going to have to get that completion percentage up, and very much so. 6% comp rate's not going to work in the Big Ten. Got to be a little bit higher there. Got to get close to 3,000 yards, in my opinion. If you can find a way to fix some of those mistakes, be a little more aggressive early on, Penn State could have a very good offense this year.
That's me for today's episode. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.